I have watched cities breathe and buckle, seen markets swell with color and then collapse into a silence, so complete the bells seem to lose their meaning. I have measured the slow accrual of stone and timber that made villages into towns, and I have felt the sudden subtraction of people from a continent. Not a thing you count in chalk marks, but a reduction in the very texture of life. Fewer voices in the streets, fewer hands in the fields, fewer feet on the stairs. That diminution arrived in a single shadowed age and left a mark on the world that still shapes the way we live. The story begins, as many human tragedies do, at the edges of encounter. In the years before 1350, trade routes stitched Europe, the Near East, and Asia into a tighter web than ever before. Ships creaked under the weight of wool and spices, caravans threaded mountain passes, and sailors and merchants carried, along with their wares, other things that do not ask permission to travel. Somewhere along the Silk Road and the Black Sea, a bacterium long accustomed to small mammal hosts found itself carried into new territory. Yersinia pestis, a name not given until centuries later, rode on fleas that hitchhiked on rats and on human breath in its most terrible form. The first shock came by sea. In the autumn of 1347, a handful of Jenny's ships limped into Mediterranean ports, their decks strewn with dead. From those ghastly arrivals, the disease leapt into cities, Marseille, Messina, Genoa, then overland into Provence and north into France, into the Low Countries, across the Alps and into England. In a matter of months, a plague that could present as swollen lymph nodes, the buboes that gave the disease its common name, or as a sudden collapse into blood poisoning or a coughing infectious lung disease, moved through villages and urban lanes with appalling speed. The victim's skin went pallid, fever rose, and breath became a labor. Some died within days. Estimates vary, and historians debate the exact numbers, but by the time the first tidal wave of death had crested in Europe, roughly 1347 to 1351, a third to nearly half of the continent's people had vanished. In some towns, half the households were gone. In others, three-quarters. What followed was not merely a tally of the dead. The soundscape changed. Gone were the rounds of apprentices, the chatter at the market stalls, the constant petitions of the poor. Bells tolled for the living and then for the dead, until tolling itself felt obscene. Fields went untended, and orchards grew wild. Entire neighborhoods emptied, and sometimes in the spaces left behind, the wind seemed louder. People sought explanations. The learned closed the books that told of humors and balancing fluids and reached for the same authorities that had guided them for centuries, only to find that theory offered no shield. Clergy preached, processions wound through dusty streets, and in some places bands of flagellants walked under the lash to atone for imagined communal sins. In other places, frightened hands looked for scapegoats. Jews, accused falsely of poisoning wells, were hunted and massacred in pogroms that compounded the catastrophe. Social order frayed at the seams, but where terror and ignorance reared, pragmatism also found a place. Even amid superstition, new practices took root. Cities learned painfully that isolation worked. Ports required ships to sit off for a time before unloading. The word quarantine, 40 days, entered the language. Lazarettos, isolated hospitals on islands or outside city walls, became early experiments in containment. Local magistrates compiled data, kept lists of the sick, and regulated burials. Those bureaucratic fragments may seem small beside the scale of death, but they were seeds of a different kind of governance: municipal responsibility for public health, record-keeping, emergency ordinances. Economically, the effect was immediate and brutal, and then strangely catalytic. With so many bodies gone, labor became scarce. Fields remained fallow until landlords, desperate for workers, offered higher wages and better terms. Peasants and laborers found bargaining power they had never known. In parts of Western Europe, this sped the decline of rigid serfdom. In England, the stress on the old feudal order helped precipitate uprisings in 1381. Landowners, meanwhile, consolidated holdings, experimented with sheep pastures in place of grain, and altered the use of land. Per capita wealth among survivors often rose. Families with fewer mouths to feed could afford better diets. Towns with fewer people found resources available for rebuilding and ornamentation. The immediate math of mortality led, oddly, to experiments in growth and efficiency. Medicine did not leap forward overnight. The old frameworks held sway and were often inadequate. Yet the plague exposed those inadequacies with such blunt force that it nudged inquiry in new directions. Physicians observed more carefully, recorded symptoms in proto-epidemiological lists, and confronted the failure of received treatments. Over generations, those small habits of observation contributed to a culture of empirical inquiry, an approach that, combined with the rising wealth of surviving patrons, would later fund anatomy, dissection, and the reappraisal of medical texts. The Museum of Human Knowledge was not rebuilt in a single generation, but the cracks through which the light later entered were made visible by catastrophe. Art and literature absorbed the crisis as if it were a lens focused on existence itself. Writers like Boccaccio gathered stories in the hush of a deserted Florence. Their tales, threaded with the shadow of death, shaped a new realism and an attention to human motives. Painters and sculptors rendered skeletons dancing through the streets, the danse macabre that reminded viewers that rank and riches were no barrier to mortality. Churches, chapels, and civic spaces were reborn with imagery that made death an everyday companion, not a spectacle, but as a subject to be reckoned with. The aesthetic of the period shifted toward the intimate and the immediate, faces that bore suffering, hands that soothed, the quiet dignity of care. The plague did not disappear in 1351. It returned in waves for centuries, flaring up in cities, in rural hamlets, in port towns that remained nodes of exchange. The bacterium persisted in rodent reservoirs and in the occasional human chain, and each recurrence reminded communities of their earlier errors and their newer defenses. Over time, recurrent exposure, changing living conditions, and the development of more systematic public health measures reduced the disease's devastation in many regions. Only much later, in the 19th century, did scientists identify Yersinia pestis as the culprit and begin to understand its transmission in modern terms. Urban life itself changed. The medieval city, once compact and tangled, gradually unrolled into something more deliberate. Planners and magistrates expanded burial grounds beyond walls, regulated garbage disposal, and codified rules about food, water, and the location of tanning pits and slaughterhouses. Streets were widened not for convenience but for sunlight and sanitation. Trade networks reconfigured, new forms of labor organization arose, guilds shifted, and the money economy pressed forward. In ways both subtle and visible, the world edged toward structures we recognize today. And yet the Black Death's legacy is not a tidy ledger of progress born from suffering. The same catastrophe that spurred medical curiosity also enabled brutality. The persecution of minorities, the recourse to superstition, the decline into violence in certain regions. The economic gains of some were the dispossession of others. The cultural flowering in art and literature rested on a human toll that cannot be reconciled with praise. The story is therefore an uneasy one. Loss and renewal braided together so that recovery itself bears the imprint of trauma. If there is a lesson in that braided history, it is one about contingency. The modern city, with its municipal health offices and regulations for traffic and waste, did not descend from a single plan. It arrived through trial and error, through grief and improvisation, through the stubborn determination of communities to continue living among the ruins. The scientific method, so often invoked as a steady march forward, advanced because practitioners kept notes and compared outcomes in the midst of failure. Artists painted what they saw and made the invisible visible. Economies restructured because people demanded wages or migrated to find them. Institutions changed because no other choice remained. We still live in a world shaped by those choices. The idea that communal health is a public concern, that cities must administer and defend themselves against invisible threats, that art and literature respond to disaster. These are legacies of a crisis that made survival both more precarious and more precious. When we walk past wide streets and municipal parks, when we enter hospitals and submit to their rules, when we read stories that make us feel the pressure of mortality, we move through spaces whose contours were deepened in the 14th century. Time does not heal evenly, it layers. The plague left scars that modernity smoothed but did not erase. Demographic shifts altered family patterns, religious faith was reshaped by doubt and consolation, tastes and styles traded the ornate for the intimate and back again. Most importantly, people learned, often by the hard school of loss, to reckon with risk in public terms. I have seen these transformations, patient as a tide and inevitable only in retrospect. Empires rose and fell. Cities rebuilt. Mothers wept and then wrapped their children in new warmth. From the same shadow that took so many, new resolve was born. A will to count, to isolate what kills, to plan the shared spaces of life, to paint what cannot be denied. The Black Death was a wound and an instruction. Its cruelty engraved a lesson that civilization would carry forward, that even amid the darkest removals, humans remake the world into something recognizable, and sometimes into something better prepared for the next unknown.